Hello and welcome to this free webinar from Edushield. My name's Lewis Donald. I'm the principal safeguarding partner here. And essentially what I want to do over the next half an hour is take you through this new piece of guidance that exists around ultimately restrictive physical interventions, titled Restrictive Interventions Including Use of Reasonable Force in Schools. It is a new piece of guidance. It's come out at the moment with its implementation date of the 1st of April 2026. And quite interestingly, it's taken a long time to update this guidance. The last time that we saw guidance similar to this was back in July 2013, which was the use of reasonable force guidance. It wasn't a statutory document, and it's been updated a few times over the years, but this is certainly the first significant or substantial rewrite that we've seen when it comes to guidance in this area. So what I want to do today is to talk to you about this new guidance that's going live in April 2026, give you a bit of an insight into what it contains, what you need to do as a school, a local authority or a multi-academy trust in terms of adapting, revising, refreshing policy and practice in this area. So that's the plan. So I think the best place to start really is to sort of look at the key differences between these two documents. Now, we know from this document that the first edition in 2013 was a non-statutory piece of guidance, and the narrative around this new piece is that it is a statutory guidance in its entirety, but it's not. There's only actually certain elements of this guidance that are statutory, linking back to some of the legislation that we'll unpick in a moment. And it's important to know that because there are key elements of this guidance that you must do to comply with the law and ultimately to please inspectors and so on. But most importantly, and I think you'll see this when you look at some of those statutory elements, is that actually what's being suggested is quite reasonable and is likely to have a positive impact on our practice and procedures in this space. So let's sort of go back in time then. So we can take ourselves back to 1987. This is where corporal punishment was outlawed in the United Kingdom. We then take ourselves across to 2006, where we had the introduction of Section 93 of the Education Act. Now, Section 93 of the Education Act, like any other piece of education law, is really, really difficult to read and by extension interpret. However, there are some really key elements that we do need to understand from it. And the first bit is to know, what does it actually mean? Well, Section 93 is the power that staff members have to use reasonable force in circumstances that are appropriate and reasonable to achieve some set key purposes. And the legislation tells us about the conditions in which we can consider the use of force. Note there the word consider, because the guidance is very clear that actually staff have the power to only use such force that is necessary in the circumstances to be able to achieve an aim. Those aims are listed in the law. And you may have heard people before say, well, you can use force to sort of stop a child hurting themselves or another. That sort of narrative comes directly from this piece of legislation. And it tells us that a member of staff may use such force as is necessary in the circumstances to prevent a pupil from doing or continuing to do any of these things. Firstly, committing an offence. Secondly, causing personal injury to or damage to the property of any person, including the pupil themselves. Or, and this is the most difficult one to interpret, is prejudicing the maintenance of good order and discipline at the school or among any pupils receiving education at the school, whether during a teaching session or otherwise. So that's the legislation that sort of exists at the moment, and what this guidance is trying to do is ultimately bring that to life a bit to give staff the confidence to know how they can lawfully apply that piece of legislation in a way that ultimately is in the best interest of the child. Now, as we go on then, we've had that piece of legislation, but quite interestingly, in 2009, a new piece of law came into play, which was the Apprenticeships, Skills, Children and Learning Act of 2009. And what that guidance did is it essentially made it a requirement at the time of choosing by the Secretary of State to tell schools that their governing body has some key responsibilities. And what it said is that at the time of the Secretary of State's choosing, they can enter into the Education Act Section 93A. Now, remember a moment ago we was talking about Section 93. This is an additional section that sits alongside that, and the requirements are that a governing body, obviously if you're a maintained school, that is your governing body for multi-academy trust, that's the proprietor, which is ultimately your trust board that hold that responsibility, that they must ensure there's procedures in place for recording each significant incident where a member of staff uses force on a pupil, and reporting each use of force, except those pupils that are aged over 20, to each pupil's parent as soon as practicable after the incident. And it goes on to say that trust boards and governing bodies must ensure that there is a procedure in place and it is being complied with. And we'll talk a little bit more about the role of governors in this in a moment. But after that piece of legislation sat there, it wasn't actually implemented, and it's not going to be implemented until this new piece of guidance comes out in April, and that's where the statutory element of the document comes into play. But following on from that, 2013, we got that new piece of guidance that we mentioned there, and essentially it kind of stuck as it was. There was a few sort of updates to sort of align it with changing legislation, updates to keeping children safe in education, and so on, up until February of 2025, when the DfE launched a public consultation into that piece of guidance with a view that they wanted to refresh it, update it, and ultimately align it with the new requirements that are coming into play in April. That consultation played out. So on the 15th of December 2025, the Secretary of State made that instruction and it was laid before Parliament, and ultimately Section 93A came into legislation as an amendment to the Education Act, which means that from April, those reporting and recording requirements become law. Now, in terms of where we got to after that then, it was that the government of the day decided in November of that year as well to start having a national conversation about seclusion. And seclusion has a really heavy focus in this new piece of guidance. And we'll talk a little bit about what seclusion means, because quite interestingly, in just a personal view, there are elements of it that probably go beyond what the government and the DfE were expecting it to do in terms of how it's applied locally. So it is important that we understand what that actually means for us. Because as we hit the end of the timeline, this guidance comes into play on the 1st of April, and schools, as we are with every other document, are going to be expected to comply with it and have it implemented from day one. So, with that in mind then, let's think about seclusion more broadly. What does that actually mean? Well, legislation, the piece of legislation we just mentioned earlier, Regulation 3, the schools recording and reporting of seclusion and restraint regulations, tell us that seclusion is defined like this. It says, a pupil is secluded by one or more members of staff if they are detained in a place apart from any other person, except the staff member or members, otherwise than as, and it goes on. The point being, the legal definition is quite hard to follow. In fact, when I read that first line that said they are detained in a place apart from any other person, I did sort of wonder whether that was a typo, but apparently not. And what it tells us is that seclusion, in its plainest of terms, means that it is the intentional confinement of a pupil alone in a space where they're separated from others, where they're prevented from leaving voluntarily, and it's not being used as a disciplinary punishment. So, again, even in its most simple terms, it is quite difficult to understand what is actually meant by that. I think in its core purpose, it's talking a lot about children with SEND and the use of crisis rooms and rooms where pupils are sent to and left into, for want of a better phrase, calm down. But I think there is challenges in there that actually, what about isolation rooms or reflection rooms and so on? And I think that's where they've tried to sort of balance it out by talking about the fact that it's not being used as a punishment. But I do think it's important that in your school, you have a serious think about what seclusion might look like in your context, and particularly when it comes to writing your policy, which we'll touch on in a little bit later, that you really sort of understand what procedures you're going to put into place to manage seclusion in terms of its reporting and those recording requirements too. Now, to give you some sort of examples then that might sort of help that thinking, when I was sort of thinking about how does seclusion, what does it look like in a school context, I came up with these really. So firstly, for seclusion, some examples might be physically blocking a pupil from leaving. locking or securing the room so that they can't get out, or making the pupil believe that they'll be punished if they try to leave. In terms of restraint and immobilization, this would be holding the pupil's body or part of their body, trying or securing them to something fixed or heavy, or taking away mobility aid that they would normally need to move, for example, a walking aid or wheelchair support. And now, again, it's really difficult to sort of think about how that would play out in practice, because particularly if we think about trying to or securing them to something fixed or heavy, that for me is quite alarming. But anyway, these are the sort of examples that the guidance brings us to. Seclusion's come into play. There's been a lot of national discourse around it, and this guidance goes some way to trying to tell us what that actually means in schools and what it is that we need to do. And I think, particularly for us now, the most important thing is understanding what that means for policy and practice in our school. So, with that in mind, I want to focus really on three things now. Firstly, understanding restrictive intervention. What does that actually mean? Because if we don't understand it, we certainly can't write a policy, inform our staff, deliver the policy in practice, etc., etc. Secondly, what does that policy actually look like? How do we need to revise it? What does it need to include? And what do we need to do in terms of our wider practice to ensure that we're aligning ourselves with that guidance? And then finally, our recording and our reporting duties. What does this actually mean for us, this new statutory element of the guidance, and how do we ensure that we are aligning our practice with those statutory requirements, but also making sure that parents get the information that they're entitled to, but also, and I would argue even more importantly, that your internal teams have a good feel for what happened in that scenario to ensure that individualised behaviour plans, broader risk assessments, training requirements, etc., are essentially constantly updated, that learning is feeding through so that you've got the intelligence you need to be able to ensure that practice is as safe, as lawful, and as effective as it can possibly be. So, with that in mind then, what does the law and the guidance tell us about who can use reasonable force? Well, the legislation tells us that all members of staff have a legal power to use reasonable force in certain circumstances. But it does tell us that staff who are likely to be involved in the use of restrictive interventions should be appropriately trained. Now, the guidance goes some way when you have a read through it to sort of outlay what that training should look like, but it doesn't recommend any certain providers or anything like that. I think if you're looking for a provider, one of the things you need to consider is this isn't, again, for want of a better phrase, martial arts training here. This is about instruction around de-escalation tactics, strategies to use communication effectively, really promoting the fact that a restrictive intervention should be the absolute last resort. It goes on to tell us as well in the guidance that school leaders are responsible for ensuring that that training is in place and deciding what it needs. But it's that key element there around the school's context that's really important. If you're working in a really small primary school where you have low instances of behaviour, you're going to have very different training requirements to a large special educational needs school in an urban setting with a lot of children, a lot of staff, etc. So thinking again about that context and making sure that you're not just going with the sort of go-to providers, but actually what you are doing is making sure that the training you commission is appropriate and is going to give the best possible learning to your settings. When it comes to using reasonable force, the guidance is really clear that schools must carry out risk assessments where restrictive intervention may be required. So if you know that you've got pupils where you've had instances of restrictive intervention, or you may need to use restrictive intervention in the future, there needs to be that really clear record that has the child at the heart of it, that involves the parents, that involves any other key agencies that are involved in that child or family's life, to make sure that where physical intervention or restrictive intervention is required, it is done so in the most safe and appropriate way it possibly can be. And then finally, and it's really important to remember that even though we're a school, we're still a sort of micro organisation, and we do, of course, have a legal duty to protect the health, safety, and welfare of staff as well. We shouldn't be putting staff in harm's way, so to speak. And certainly when it comes to thinking about our risk assessments and our restrictive intervention plans, that we have the staff's well-being at the heart of this too. The guidance goes on to tell us as well that there are, of course, unacceptable uses of force in a school. It talks really clearly about how it's illegal to use force on a pupil for the purposes of punishment. That's ultimately that sort of corporal punishment element that we spoke about earlier. It tells us that pupils shouldn't be restrained in any way that sort of impacts their airway, their breathing, their circulation, for example, by covering their mouth or applying pressure to their chest, etc. And it does tell us as well that where appropriate, the pupil should receive a medical assessment and treatment for any injuries as soon as possible. That really, for me, that element of the guidance is saying to us really clearly there that actually we should have a safeguarding first approach whenever restrictive intervention is necessary. And where it is necessary, it is the absolute minimum force that's needed to require the intended outcome, which is ultimately linking back to that piece of guidance around preventing injury to themselves or others, etc., etc. So, a really good way of thinking about when it's appropriate to use physical interventions, it's important that we note that whilst that guidance in there tells us about the need to ensure that any physical intervention is appropriate in the circumstances, actually the guidance goes that step further by applying the sort of common law test around the use of force more generally. Now, in common law, any person has the power to use such force as is reasonable in the circumstances to protect themselves or to prevent the immediate harm to themselves or another. The guidance tells us that we should follow those principles by ensuring that our any action is justified, appropriate, proportionate, necessary, and ultimately through our recording and reporting, accountable. Now, some of you know my background before education was in policing, and this was a mnemonic that we used all the time for any time we had to use of force on a person, which was Japan. And we'd often ask ourselves, is that course of conduct, was that hold, was that use of force Japan? Was it justified? Can I justify why I needed to do that? Was it appropriate in the circumstances? Did I have no other options? I couldn't use communication, verbal reasoning, etc. Was it proportionate? If I go into a bar fight, for example, in policing, and there's two people punching each other, I take one person away, and they're still flaring their arms around, and suddenly I bring my baton out and start smashing them across the head. That isn't proportionate in the circumstances. I should only use such force that is necessary to alleviate that risk and to remove that piece of harm. If, of course, he turned up with a knife, is it then appropriate for me to use an escalated level of force to prevent that? Of course it is, and that's where that question of proportionality comes into play. In terms of accountable, this is our recording and our reporting. One of the key elements of your policy should be to lay out really clearly that records should be made by the end of that school day. That's what the law tells us. And finally, is it necessary? Do I really need to do this? Is there no other option possible other than to apply a restrictive intervention? And if all those conditions are met, I can use that force, but where I do use that force, I'm constantly going around that Japan cycle. Does this hold continue to be ticking off all those areas? And if it doesn't, then I remove myself from that situation. Now, in terms of pupils with SEND, we already know this, and guidance really reinforces it with us, that pupils with SEND are likely to experience an increased amount of distress when through their behaviour, and then can be disproportionately affected by the use of reasonable interventions. So, with that in mind, particularly when we're thinking about our risk assessments and our physical and restrictive intervention plans, making sure that staff are aware of the importance of understanding behaviour triggers, recognising the need for prevention and de-escalation, and making sure as well that where a restrictive intervention is necessary, we're reviewing that regularly, even if this child is likely to need restrictive intervention more frequently than some of their peers. So, in terms of our recording and our reporting duties, then I mentioned at the beginning that elements of this statutory guidance are statutory, and it's the recording and the reporting duties that very much are that statutory element. So, what it tells us really clearly, first off, is three things. These are the three statutory areas we need to think about. Firstly, recording the use of force. It tells us that governing bodies and the proprietors of other schools, such as your trust board, must ensure that a procedure is in place for recording each significant incident in which a member of staff uses force on a pupil as part of their duties under Section 93A of the Education Act. That word significant incident comes out quite a lot when we're looking through the guidance and looking through the legislation. And there is a risk in this that we look at that terminology of significant incident and almost assume that if there's a certain almost spectrum as to how significant a hold must be before it's recorded and reported. But actually, if we were to look specifically at what the legislation tells us, it defines a significant incident as any incident where the use of force goes beyond appropriate physical contact between the pupils and staff. Now, it's all and good as saying that, but we need to kind of understand where it might be appropriate to use force with a pupil. And the guidance tells us that there are certain circumstances where the use of force may be appropriate. It tells us in there that if we are applying first aid, if we're comforting a distressed child, if we're using force or placing our hands on children to support them in terms of learning a musical instrument or using sports equipment or playing sport, etc. So the reason it talks about significant incident is where that force or that use of a hold or contact goes beyond either the sort of acceptable use of force as laid out in the guidance, or is a duty that's been exercised under that Section 98 power. Now, the second element really is around reporting the use of force to parents. The guidance is really, really clear in here that it tells us that we have a duty to ensure that we report to parents by the end of the day in writing where force has been used. There are, of course, some exceptions to that. The guidance tells us that if the pupil is aged 20 or over, or it would appear to the member of staff that making that report to the parent is likely to place that child at significant risk of harm, we need to apply those normal safeguarding exemptions to information sharing that we would, and instead go down the route of working with children's services. But the main key element of this sort of statutory element is the need to make sure we make that report at the end of the day to parents in writing. It goes on to talk about in there that governing bodies of maintained schools, proprietors, trust boards, you get it, have a procedure in place for recording each incident of seclusion as part of the school's duties as well. And the guidance gives us some advice, and I would encourage you to have a look at the guidance and see if you can spot this for yourself, what that record should look like. It talks about some more obvious things such as name, staff members involved, time, date, location, etc. But it also talks in there about capturing whether that pupil has any protected characteristics, whether they're identified as having special educational needs, and so on and so forth. Because making sure that that report has been made in writing is really, really key. And without doing that, ultimately, we're not meeting our statutory requirements in there. There's just on the screen now, there's some examples as to what that sort of the key boxes that you would need to complete as part of that report would look like. And I encourage you, when you get the slides from this, to have a think about this slide in particular, read through the guidance, and when you're developing those recording systems in your school, making sure you capture off all the areas that the government are expecting us to do. So, the second part is really about governing bodies then, or trust boards, and what their duties are when it comes to ensuring that they are receiving the right information and that they can meet their duty of taking all reasonable steps to ensure that the school's procedures for recording and reporting the use of force and seclusion and restraint are complied with. And the guidance gives us some sort of tips as to what that might look like. It tells us that we need to ensure that our governing bodies, our trust boards, etc., have certain bits of information. What that information looks like is very much down to you and your context, but you need to ensure that it's meeting these 5 points, that it enables that governing body to identify and implement improvements to policy and practice, to identify areas for learning and development, to interrogate the effectiveness of pupil support measures. So particularly their reporting on sort of risk assessments, restrictive intervention plans, etc. And giving them enough data so that they can identify any disproportionate use of restrictive interventions, particularly with those pupils that share protected characteristics, have SEND, or other types of vulnerabilities. And governing bodies as well and trust boards should consider the limitations of data. And what it means by that is that you don't meet this standard by simply giving your board or giving your governing body loads and loads of data. This is around giving them that wider contextual picture. It's not for them to scrutinise case records, that's certainly not their job, but it's about giving them enough information so they can meet those requirements, so they can meet those expectations, and ultimately provide you with that support and challenge you need in this area. And of course, that is going to fit into your policy development in there. And the guidance is really clear that we need to develop or revise our existing restrictive intervention policies to make sure that they capture all these new statutory requirements and that the guidance itself can play out in practice. So what does that actually mean then when it comes to developing that policy? Now, there's a number of different things that need to be included in your policy which are laid out in the guidance, and I've tried to capture them here for you. So again, when you get the slides, have a proper look through. But essentially, this isn't a massive significant rewrite. What it is, it's about updating your policy to ensure that A, you have one, because not everyone has one, to make sure that if you're choosing to have a standalone policy, because the guidance does give us that ability to break it down and put it into your behaviour policy if you wish, if you're having that standalone policy, which I do think is the better option here, because it's going to need to be shared with parents and staff, placed on your website, etc., that actually in there, we're capturing what our statutory duties are, we're explaining what physical intervention looks like, what restrictive intervention, seclusion, etc., sets out when use of force is appropriate, talks about your recording and your reporting procedures, what staff training expectations you've got. It has a clear section in there around reasonable adjustments for pupils with SEND. It talks about the importance of post-incident review and support, and ultimately is available for anyone to read. So just an example of what would be really good practice here is that actually, whilst it's all well and good having a black and white policy that's set out, having something as well that's pupil friendly is a really good way of sharing with pupils why it is that restrictive intervention may be necessary, particularly in high profile instances. If there's a quite significant incident that occurs maybe in the playground and other pupils have seen that, there is an element of that, again, that safeguarding first response that needs to be applied to the wider school community, and having a pupil friendly policy that some pupils may choose to read is a really good way of getting that across. Now, to make your life a little bit easier, I quite enjoy writing policies, and I've written this from scratch. So it captures all the statutory requirements that are in the guidance. It captures off what it is that you need to include in there, all those areas I've just ticked off, and hopefully that might make your life a little bit easier. So please feel free to scan that QR code now, or if you just go down this website a little bit, you will see a link to be able to download the slides and the policy document in there too. Please feel free to use that as you wish. So finally then, in terms of our reflections and our takeaways, this really is a piece of guidance that is there to support you in understanding how to utilise your legal powers and your legal duties under this new piece of guidance. It's more of a legal shift as opposed to a massive change in practice, and this new piece of guidance really just introduce into a statutory guidance type form some of the legislation that's been updated in this area. It really reinforces that every significant incident matters, and having that safeguarding first approach is how you ensure that where it is absolutely necessary to use force, it's done in the safest possible way, and the wider context of that incident is captured, reflected on, learnt from, recorded, and reported. I'll close by saying that actually this piece of guidance is there ultimately, again, to support you. It's a relatively short guidance in the context of how long the rest of them kind of are sometimes. So have a real read through and think about how that works in your setting, and particularly when it comes to revising your policy, thinking about what it is that you need to do. Now, just to close, I hope you don't mind me saying that we've got a couple of things happening at Edushield that I want to draw to your attention. The first one is Edushield Plus, which is launching at the beginning of February, which is our online affordable resource platform where you're going to get access to loads of policy templates, the kind of forms you might need on a day-to-day basis, governance documents, CPD webinars and training sessions, slides like this that you can download yourself, put your own logos on and use with your own staff, our DSL Connect community as well, where you'll have access to other DSLs to be able to ask questions and get that sort of live support in there for you. That's coming out beginning of February, so keep an eye on sales socials for that. And secondly, I just want to introduce you as well to our online single central record course. Now, for anyone that knows me will know that I'm really sad and I love the single central record, and I've been keen for a long time to sort of demystify a lot of this apparent good practice that exists around the SCR, because there is none. It's a simple paragraph in, never mind. But this 10-part e-learning course is designed for you to be self-guided, for you to be able to walk through and get access to all the resources you need. So there we go. I hope you found that useful. Like I say, the guidance isn't necessarily something that we really need to worry about. It's just about reading it, understanding it, and applying it in your setting. Hopefully we'll see you soon on another Redshield session. But in the meantime, stay safe. Thank you for everything you do, and I look forward to chatting to you again.